Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. If you are tired of picking between the lesser of two evils and news presented in either red or blue, you are not alone. And every week, we discuss the structural issues driving dysfunction in Washington and what we can do to fix it. Now, since their losses in November of last year, Democrats have begun to ask how they can better reach moderate and working class voters, with some openly wondering if their party has lost touch. And given the most recent Democratic National Committee included an extended debate over how to maintain a gender balance amongst their officers when one or more is non-binary, it's clear they're going to be asking that question a little longer. But are Republicans doing much better? Since taking power in January, Republicans have taken the mandate given to them by voters seeking economic relief and used it to rename the Gulf of Mexico and cut the 1% of the federal budget paid to American farmers to feed starving people. So today, we're going to explore whether both parties should be asking this question. So, Shawn, this episode was teed up by a recent comment by Seth Moulton, a moderate Democratic representative of my home state of Massachusetts, who said that the Democratic Party had fallen out of touch with the majority of Americans. And this isn't something that's only been stated by Moulton. He's not the first to say this. So, for example, recently Pete Buttigieg described the DNC's focus on diversity initiatives as a caricature of everything that is wrong with the party's ability to reach out to voters. And so the big question here, and the big question we're going to be asking and exploring is that true? And if that is true, can we not say the same thing about the Republicans as well?
Yeah, I think when you look at it, you can say the same thing about both parties. And I know we're going to explore that in a bit. But taking a step back and looking at the Democratic Party specifically, the one thing that I would challenge the audience to consider is the focus that the party puts on institutional homogeny. And you mentioned it already a little bit, how they put this focus on how balanced their committee looks. You know, they put this focus on how the party appears. And because of that, you know, they're very good at keeping their members in line and having them sing to the same tune, but all that focus is put there and not speaking directly to the voters they need to get them to win future elections.
Well, I think that's exactly it. And I think that anyone on the left would say our economic platforms are really geared to help those experiencing economic distress and better geared to do so than the Republicans. And I think that's fair. I think the problem is when you expect voters to read. If you give them a lengthy policy document, right, what they're going to remember is the stuff that might be most out of step with how they think. And I think a lot of these identity-focused efforts, while well-intentioned, are the things that voters end up walking away with.
I think you're seeing an identity crisis with both parties, but for very different reasons. But I think with the Democratic Party, the issue is that they are struggling to energize their base and convey those very economic policies that poll after poll will show are popular. When you look at just the data, you can see that there's a lot of things within the Democratic platform that are overwhelmingly popular with the American people, even with some Republicans, but they struggle to get that message out in a way that's going to energize voters to get behind them.
Yeah, I think you're 100% correct. And to take that a step further, there was an article put out on Substack by Adam Frisch, who was the Democrat who almost beat Lauren Boebert in her, I guess we could call it re-election bid, although she was running in a new district. And the thing he noted was how at the DNC meeting, 21 of the 30 events were focused on identity groups like the LGBTQ caucus and the Interfaith Council, and it left out broader voter issues such as the economy and public safety. And so, again, he wasn't openly criticizing those councils in and of themselves. But what he was saying is that it didn't really leave room for the stuff the majority of voters really cared about. Another thing he noted, which I thought was really interesting, was that the majority of people, if not all of the people at that meeting, had a college degree.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look across the country, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 30%, maybe 40% tops of Americans have a bachelor's degree,
Mm-hmm.
right? The remainder have associates or lower. So I think Democrats do have to ask themselves that if they believe that representation matters, if they
Mm-hmm.
believe that it's important to have the people you're negotiating for in the room with you, how are you going to reach non-college educated voters when none of your party's membership or leadership are non-college educated?
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to speak to those people if they're not in the room?
Right. I think this focus on a specific identity of what it means to be a Democrat is an issue the party continues to face. It's something that AOC noted with Jon Stewart when she noted that the perception of who the Democrats are speaking to is not the very working class people that they say that they're fighting for. It's upper middle class people who think they're upper middle class but are in fact wealthy, and as a result they miss the mark. And there's a lot of working class voters who they used to be able to rely on who are now leaving the party entirely.
And I also think that Democrats misunderstand their appeal because if you look at the number of black voters or the number of Hispanic voters who cast ballots for Trump in the last election, right, it's clear people were voting with their wallets.
Mm-hmm.
And that's generally how people vote. You might get a slice of a certain population by pandering, but on the whole, people value economic security over anything else and
Mm-hmm.
physical security over anything else, right?
I think the one thing that AOC is touching on, and I'm not just saying this to kind of hype her up, but I do think that she is hitting some critical marks when she talks about where the Democratic Party is failing right now. Is if you speak directly to the working class voter, the individual voter, all of those identity check marks that you want to hit will just naturally come with those,
Hmm.
because you are talking to the black voter and the Latino voter and all of these traditionally and historically marginalized groups. When you speak to their financial concerns as people who exist within a working class, and these are people who may be, working paycheck to paycheck, but if you're not speaking directly to those economic needs and are focused more on the identity of what it means to be a Democrat, then you are missing the point entirely. And you're giving your opposing party a clear opening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're playing on the Republicans' field here. And
Hmm.
I'll talk about that in a little bit. But one note I want to leave off with, this is something I talked about in an episode prior, is that if you look at the New Deal Democratic coalition, which really dominated American politics for about 30 years, right? 30, 40 years, it was an economic coalition. So you
Hmm.
had active members of the KKK and active members of the NAACP in the same party. And they were united because of FDR's economic programs. So economics will trump identity any day of the week. Any
Hmm.
day of the week. I think everybody has worked for somebody that they don't like before, right? That tells you all you need to know.
And I think with the Democrats in particular, they need to be able to speak to these economic issues in a way that is going to be very easy to digest for voters, while also being able to energize their base. And energizing people on economic issues is not easy. And it's a very, very boring topic. And right now, when it comes to energizing their base, Republicans have the advantage because they can energize their base on cultural issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'd agree there, and I think that gets into where the Democrats are playing on the Republicans' field, because if we switch over to the Republican Party, a lot of the policies they've been implementing in the month or so that they've been in power aren't all that popular. Everybody hates Doge. Nobody approves of the mass layoffs. I think people are scratching their head with the elimination of DEI programs. Not that necessarily they endorsed them, but just it wasn't top on their list. A majority of those polled in a recent Reuters Ipsos poll opposed Musk's task force, and then a slight majority opposed the closing of all federal DEI offices and firing employees, right? And if you go back to exit polling and see why people voted, you won't hear DEI, you won't hear the deficit, you won't hear the budget, you won't hear, God damn it, why does Mexico get their Gulf and we don't? None of that makes the list. And this gets to something that I've said time and time again, which is if you look at where the winnable voters lie in American politics, they are very economically aligned with the Democrats, but culturally they're more aligned with Republicans.
Mhm.
And it's not necessarily like they're saying close all DEI offices. And it's not like they're saying take away protections for transgender people. But when you can't afford to take a vacation because your grocery bill is doubled, and one party is dedicating 1 calorie to identity issues, that's going to be a WTF moment. And I think this is where Republicans are winning right now, because they're able to really use those identity issues as a way to appeal to voters that they're not otherwise working for on the economic front.
And I think that's the great irony of the situation, because voters did choose the path that they thought was going to prioritize the economy. Again, voters sent a clear mandate in the election, do something about the economy. And when they see one party prioritizing identity politics and identity issues, and the other party that is not in the status quo at the moment. They're not in power at the moment. Their only option is really to go to that other party, even though ironically that party is also speaking to these very cultural issues to invigorate their base, to energize their base. When Trump talks about how illegal immigrants are invading this country, that gets people angry. That gets conservatives angry, and so that motivates them to get out and vote. So yeah, I think you're going to start to see a little bit of buyer's remorse from voters
Yeah.
going forward, especially if the administration continues to prioritize these cultural issues. But
That's
yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. You know what? I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you raise a really interesting point, which is if you look, Democrats use identity issues to energize their base,
Hmm.
and Republicans use identity issues to energize the winnable voters,
Hmm.
right? So, in a lot of ways, this gets back to something you and I have kind of pondered in past episodes, which is, would the Democrats be better going full on like Bernie Sanders,
Yeah,
right? And I think there's an argument to be made, yes.
I
I,
think so too.
right?
I think so too. I think in elections they're a little too. There's this idea right now, and it's an idea that Democrats keep pushing, particularly in response to any loss they have in an election,
Yeah,
that they have to focus on being moderates.
yeah.
And the more they do that, the less successful they are, because they end up alienating many people within their own base. Meanwhile, the Republicans are more than happy to feed their base every single line they like to hear. That's what you heard from Trump on the campaign trail, was touching on every single little trigger phrase and word that's going to get the Republican base excited. Meanwhile, Democratic voters are struggling right now to find something to be excited about.
So it's clear that both parties are either culturally or economically mismatched with where, again, the winnable voters lie. And I think we should probably talk about who those winnable voters are, because you have your diehard progressives in one corner. These are people who are going to vote Democrat no matter what. You have your diehard conservatives in the other corner. And that's really kind of a mix as we've spoken about before, of your Christian right, but then also your populist right as well, the nationalist right. Folks who are more in favor of Trump's more isolationist policies, right? But in the middle, you've got about, let's call it like 40% of all voters fall into one of two camps. First, you have these, I guess, what we call pragmatists. And these are folks who prefer more moderate politicians, people who seek bipartisan consensus. They're looking for folks who effectively are going to get in the government and actually work, actually govern, actually get stuff done, right? Now, the second group are more like the cynics. And these folks are effectively politically homeless. I think they really come with a more reform based mindset. I think in a lot of ways, they've kind of given up on the two parties and they're trying to look for a way out, an exit. And these are both, regardless of their outlook, they're both kind of your lesser of two evils voters, right? So the pragmatists may vote in favor of someone they view as sufficiently moderate and do so willingly. But for the most part, they're voting to reduce damage, right? They're voting because they're really scared of what the other party is going to do in office and they're not 100% bought in to what the party they're voting for is going to do. And I think this is why we have this stark contrast in administrations. Because again, you have to ask yourself, Trump and Biden or Trump and Obama, very, very different people, very, very different approaches. How is it that both candidates end up sitting in the White House? How is it that the same country elects the same people? And it gets back to the fact that there really isn't a preference for either of them.
Yeah.
There really isn't a preference for either party. There's only two choices. That's the problem.
Right. And you hit the nail on the head. It really highlights the problem within our system that voters that end up making a plurality to a majority, right, of people who just want the government to get things done and get things done for them. They're not the ones that are being listened to. It is the partisan minority, the ideological minority on both sides that get the most attention as a result of the system that we have that incentivizes the parties to cater specifically and really only to their bases and just hope that everyone else is so fed up with the other side that they're going to vote their way.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And to put this in more concrete terms, if you go all the way back to 1992, the top three issues have always been education, the economy, and healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
Those have always been the top three issues in every election. And the only reason that I only went back to 1992 is because that's as far as the data went. So for all we know, that could go back to 1783. So to repeat what you said, what we have is, I think, a culture war going on to win over voters who are really more interested in the economic one, right? That is what we're hearing more and more of. So getting back to the criticisms we offered earlier, I don't think they necessarily care about the gender or ethnic or racial balance of the president's cabinet. And they definitely don't care about having a Gulf of America. I think the answer, getting back to the original question we asked, which party is more out of touch? I'd say they're both equally out of touch.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, they don't really care about being more in touch.
Right.
They care about being in touch with just enough people to give them that one vote that they need to get over the edge.
And the more that the system incentivizes them to put their base before the electorate at large, the more we're going to continue to see these what can only be described as wedge issues be exacerbated beyond their relevance.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're going to end this episode where we always end it, and with a call to action. The reason that we are in this situation in the United States is because politicians don't need to win over a majority of voters in order to take office. They need to win their base, and they need to win over just enough voters to get a plurality. And there are reforms we can put into place to fix it. Open nonpartisan primaries to remove the power a party's base has to select candidates. Ranked choice voting, multi-member districts that would make it easier for smaller parties to form and challenge the two major parties. These are reforms that can have a real impact, and I would encourage anyone who this resonates with to go out and research those reforms. Find an organization in your state. If you can't find one, found one. And if you don't know how to do that, get in touch with me or Shawn in the comments. We'll be sure to respond. We are going to cap it off there. Thank you for listening. And if you liked what you heard today, Shawn and I have a simple request. Now, most Americans, as we've talked about, are stuck in the crossfire between warring political extremes. And our goal with this podcast is simple: to turn that frustrated majority into a powerful force for real political reform. And if this sounds like you, here's how you can help. Subscribe to the podcast, share it with others who you think might like it, and take a moment to rate this episode and review us. The more people who join this conversation, the bigger the impact we can make. The music you're hearing is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.